Hello, I'm Chiranjib Sengupta, and you're with me on the Energy Connects podcast. This episode is part of our ongoing coverage of the Middle East conflict and its impact on global energy markets. It's the beginning of week 3 of the ongoing hostilities, and the global spotlight is as much on volatile oil prices as they are on the natural gas and LNG markets. LNG and natural gas prices across Asia and Europe have jumped amid severe disruption to seaborne supplies. Under such circumstances, what does the future look like for the industry, and how resilient is it to prevail over the ongoing situation? To discuss this and a lot more, I'm joined by Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Anne-Sophie, thank you so much for joining us on the Energy Connects podcast. Sincerely appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, to start off, we're at the beginning of week 3 of the ongoing hostilities. There seems to be no sign of let up. Where are the markets going with this, especially when you talk about the outlook for global gas and LNG markets?
Well, what is very interesting is that we have seen gas prices increasing, but we are absolutely not at the levels that we were experiencing in 2022. I mean, the markets last week were at about 50 euro per megawatt hour in Europe, and this is way below what we had in 2022, which was most of the time above 100 euro per megawatt hour. So what we are also starting to see is some cargoes being redirected, in particular from Europe to Asia. So maybe what is important to say right at the beginning is right now we have the equivalent of about 110 billion cubic meters of LNG flows going through the Strait of Hormuz, which have been impacted. So this is mostly coming from Qatar, and most of that LNG usually is going to Asia. So countries such as China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And there is a little bit more than 10 billion cubic meters, which is going to Europe. But definitely Asia is the most impacted region, which is probably the reason why we are seeing some diversion of cargoes from Europe to Asia.
And obviously, all eyes are on the Hormuz, where the geopolitical risk premium, especially for LNG cargoes, seem to have gone up. We saw a few, I think, shipments, especially I think India mentioned like 2 butane carrying ships were able to sail through. So there's some, I think, limited amount of supply going through, but the rest is all stuck, like you mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, I mean, we have seen a lot of different statements coming from the US president, the US administration, whereby, I mean, maybe the Navy would be able to escort the ships or not. I mean, it has been very uncertain to determine. I think right now everybody is in a wait and see mode. What is sure is that the ship owners and the crews, I mean, they are really going to wait to see whether this is in practice doable. It's actually not that easy because, as we all know, the Strait of Hormuz is really, really a very narrow uh, lane. And unfortunately, it's a little bit like sitting ducks. It's very easy to target those ships. And we have now seen what it means actually in practice to have a LNG cargo hit by a drone because a Russian LNG cargo belonging to the Russian Dark Fleet has actually been hit in the Mediterranean. So it's something separate, but now we know what it means in practice. And of course, nobody wants to see that. So I am sure people from the Emirates and from Qatar don't want to see their ships sinking in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz.
And Sophie, you mentioned the impact on Asia, and if this the closure continues for a prolonged period, what's your outlook on how does it impact Asia, and then obviously the knock-on effect on Europe and the rest of the world?
It's a very interesting question because I think there are going to be different responses depending on how dependent the countries are. Of course, I mean, if you are looking at the volumes in absolute terms, the country the most impacted is China. However, I am in general less worried about China than I am about the other countries because China is a relatively big market. So this is about 30 BCM, but out of our 440 billion cubic meters. So it's not that much. And on top of that, I mean, in China, what people need to understand is that the growth of gas demand is very much determined by the government policy, gas prices, and economic activity. While gas prices are high, government policy may actually say, well, we don't really want to see too much coal to gas switching this year, so that should actually dampen the gas demand growth, especially, for example, in areas such as LNG trucking. And also economic activity, well, still remains to be seen how these very high energy prices, both oil and gas, are actually going to impact the global economic growth. But overall, I am less worried about China because I think there is some potential to switch from basically gas to coal, especially in the power generation sector. Countries such as India, Thailand, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the affordability is going to be a big problem, and they are all quite dependent on these LNG cargoes. In particular, Pakistan is very dependent. However, Pakistan was on an interesting trajectory because um, they were hit by the crisis in 2022, and I think they wanted to actually reduce their dependency on LNG. But for a country like India, which is a very big importer, about 60% of their LNG is actually coming from the region. So, I mean, it really depends how dearly they need those LNG cargoes. I think countries such as Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, well, first of all, they will probably try to do something on the demand side, especially power generation, so power demand side, and also some switching to coal-fired generation. The most impacted is definitely Taiwan. About a third of their LNG was coming from the region. I think there is probably a bit of way to adapt in Japan, which was much less dependent on Middle Eastern LNG. So all that means that Europe, which has been really counting on a lot of flexible LNG, is probably in a bad position. So what is important, and it's probably also the reason why we are not seeing, gas prices moving to very high levels right now, is that the cargoes are still arriving. I mean, for example, to Europe, the cargoes which were loaded about a month ago in Qatar, they are arriving. They are still arriving to Europe, and they are still arriving to Asia, over Asia at a shorter distance. But eventually, we are going to start seeing, in Europe, we are actually missing something like 1 BCM per month, roughly. And then we are also starting to see where the cargo is going somewhere else. And the problem is that we are moving into the injection period. And it's very important that we actually refill the storage because in Europe, we have relatively high demand during the winter period. So what I'm saying is that the injection period is potentially at risk if this conflict extends, if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for an extended period, and if on top of that, well, we hope not, but if some infrastructure is going to be damaged in either the United Arab Emirates or Qatar. So I think this is what we are all going to look at, to what extent the refillings really restarts in European storage. Let me add, however, that we have been blessed by a relatively mild weather over the first 2 weeks in March in Europe. So overall, the drop in the storage filling levels has not been too bad. But the past few days have been cold, really cold. So let's see.
Absolutely. And I think during our earlier conversations, you had mentioned that even before the crisis, before all the conflict started, markets were in kind of a tight situation. And I know that, there was a lot of talk earlier this year about whether there will be an LNG glut. But now, how do you see that working out?
Actually, that was my post yesterday night. But no, you're right. I mean, I think we were moving towards a rebalancing of the global gas market. Prices were still above what we had in the pre-crisis period, which for me is the period 2015-2019. So, seeing prices at 20 euro per megawatt hour in Europe, I mean, that was kind of the normal that we wanted to go back to. Prices were at 30 just before the crisis started, so we were still in a relatively tight market, especially because winter had been kind of normal in Europe, and we had also a very cold winter in other parts of the world, such as the United States and Northeast Asia. So overall, we were in a tight market. However, based on all the LNG which was expected to come in 2026 and even more in 2027, the view was that by 2027, and definitely maybe starting in 2026, we will start seeing a drop in prices. Now, everything is up in the air. First of all, because the growth in LNG supply in 2026 is going to be much lower than everybody expects. And of course, if that crisis extends, well, there might be a point at which, unfortunately, there is no growth at all. So I think, if we are looking at 2 months of disruption, 2 months and a half, we may be actually looking at zero growth in terms of additional LNG supply. And then there is the additional question. I mean, how long is it going to take to the North Field expansion to actually come to the market? I mean, we can expect some delays, but we don't know again how much delay we can expect. So it's a big question right now. I mean, is the LNG oversupply dead or delayed? That depends very much on what is going to happen in Qatar. And it's kind of ironic that the US seems to be benefiting from a US LNG perspective from, the conflict that the US has actually started, and Qatar is not.
Absolutely. And a quick sort of sub question on that. And because, like, for example, Venture Global last week, they were assuring customers. Earlier, we saw Cheniere was also looking at the situation across North America. So, for example, the Canadian Prime Minister has said that, LNG is one of the areas that they're also looking at. And obviously, that's a much longer time horizon. How do you see these adjustments sort of playing out?
Well, I have no doubt that right now, I mean, US LNG exporters are looking at that with a lot of interest, thinking, they are causing themselves as a reliable LNG supplier. Indeed, I mean, they have not been impacted and they can deliver flexible LNG cargoes to all the customers which are in need. However, even before, this whole crisis started, we were looking at a potentially quite high concentration of LNG exports when all the LNG plants which are currently under construction are going to be built. So we were looking roughly at about, 30% in the hands of the United States, and then United States and Qatar combined will be almost 50% of the global LNG market. This is pretty high concentration, and that's probably also why we have countries such as Canada which are thinking, well, maybe I can pose myself as an alternative. The only downside is that we all love Canada, but I mean, it takes forever for an LNG project to actually move forward. If you remember LNG Canada and the other projects such as Cedar LNG and Woodfibre LNG, I mean, how long did it take? I was working at the IEA up to 2014, and we were looking at, two parallel tracks, US on one side and Canada on the other, and we all know how this ended. A lot of LNG in the US and very few plants in Canada. So I am moderately optimistic about Canada managing to actually sort out all their problems in order to deliver an LNG plant in the next 2 years. That is an FID. But this being said, I think this is a second big crisis that we are experimenting in 5 years. Well, Europe has been particularly hit, but other countries in Asia have been particularly hit. And I think, this is a problem for the image that the LNG industry is trying to give, which is, reliable and affordable fuel. Well, affordable, maybe not that much right now. And available, when you have, 20% of the global energy market, which has just disappeared in like one day. I mean, we all hope it's going to come back, but the problem is that right now it's not available. It's complicated. So what I'm really wondering is whether this is going to be the signal for a certain number of countries to actually say, well, we have changed our mind. We are going to find alternatives. So in Europe, I am hearing a lot of let's electrify much more, which of course presents some additional risks, but let's electrify much more. Or maybe, let's have a partnership with Norway, or let's try to develop our own gas. I mean, plenty of things. And in Asia, maybe other countries can actually follow the path of Pakistan. Again, developing a lot of renewables. So, in Asia, and in particular in Southeast Asia, the question mark has always been to what extent can LNG actually displace coal? And it's not easy. I mean, if you are looking at the numbers, it's absolutely not easy. Existing coal is much cheaper than LNG in gas power generation. So I know there are other sectors, but it has always been that story that LNG has potential to displace coal fired generation, existing coal fired generation. And I think that may be in question right now. And it's going to be very important to look at, how countries are adapting their future energy strategy to, this new world with insecurity. And it also depends on how this conflict is going to end. I mean, if, tomorrow President Trump says, okay, we have come, everything is flat out, we have destroyed the navies, whatever they have, we think we won, so we go back and declares victory. But in fact, this is still leaving the existing regime in place. So, the threat is going to remain, and that is problematic. Only if you see a victory of the US and a fall of the regime will people be like, okay, so now, we can move forward and the danger is gone and no problem at all. And the other big danger for the LNG industry, especially, the LNG industry in this region, because let's not forget that there is not only Qatar, but also Ruwais in the United Arab Emirates, is if this conflict extends. This is going to impact the construction, but also the existing flows. And on top of that, well, I mean, the money, the revenues, for both countries. So this is a pretty big deal that we are talking about. And it will also impact the trust that many customers may have in these countries, which, I mean, until now have been really, I mean, fantastically reliable suppliers of LNG.
Absolutely. And that leads me to my next question. Like over the long term, how do you see the industry sort of responding to the challenges that they are facing during this conflict? Do you see any sort of structural changes, or how does the horizon look like?
I think it really, really depends on how this conflict ends. So for the moment, the players in the Middle East, which by the way have been expanding beyond, their horizons. I mean, um, they really depend on the end of the conflict. So, we can try to sketch out many, many scenarios, but at the end, it really depends on whether we see a bright future in terms of the Strait of Hormuz path or not, and the length and the duration of this conflict.
Excellent insights there. Anne-Sophie, thank you so much for joining us on the Energy Connects podcast. It's always such a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure too.
That was Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Energy Connects podcast. And you can go to energyconnects.com, get our comprehensive coverage of the Middle East conflict, and a lot more. Don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter to get constant updates on the conflict and the industry. A big thank you also to our amazing production team working behind the scenes to bring these episodes to life for you. Thank you, and I'll see you soon on the next episode of the Energy Connects podcast.